RadioShack was one of the leading electronics retailers during the 1980s. Whenever you walked into one of their stores, you'd certainly be greeted by a Tandy 1000 on display, which was their IBM PC competitor, but typically there'd be another section devoted to the Tandy Color Computer, which was their proprietary 8-bit home computer system. Now keep in mind that RadioShack was selling at least 6 different incompatible computer systems simultaneously. The Tandy 1000, which was their flagship product of the mid-1980s, was an MS-DOS computer. They were also still selling the traditional TRS-80 line of computers, which were just text-only computers aimed at business. Then they had the little pocket computers, some of which were rebranded from Sharp and some from Casio. And then, of course, the Model 100 line of portable computers. And these were just rebranded from Kyocera. And then the machine we're going to be looking into, the Tandy Color Computer, which was meant to be an affordable computer for the home. They also had the MC10 Color Computer, but despite the name, it's not compatible with the main color computer, and we won't be covering that today. So, the first question to answer is, how did the color computer come to be? RadioShack had already been selling the TRS-80 line of computers for a couple of years, but since it was purely text-based, they were probably looking for something that could play video games better. So, to get the full story, I went to visit my friend Eddie Malfris, who also runs TandyShowcase.com, so he could walk me through some of his collection. The story actually begins with this little device that looks suspiciously like a TRS-80 Model 1, with its keyboard replaced by a number pad. This is known as Project Green Thumb. It was built in cooperation with Motorola and the University of Kentucky, as well as Tandy, Grumman, NOAA, and the state of Kentucky, and possibly others. And the idea was to give farmers instant access to information they needed about weather, crops, and market data. The interface was pretty simple, meant to be controlled by just typing in a few numeric digits to tell it what you want. Then it would place a call to get that info. Unfortunately, the service doesn't exist anymore, so I can't show you any more than that. The device connects to the RF input of a television, and about the only I/O it has is a modem. There were only about 250 of these ever built, and this is the last known survivor from that project. This project led to the development of a more refined device, the AgVision. It looks suspiciously like a color computer, but was designed mostly for the same purpose as the Green Thumb. However, one interesting thing is, while it still basically just has a modem as the only port on the back, it does have knockouts for the rest of the ports you'd eventually find on the color computer, which means they were already thinking about both uses when the case was designed. In fact, you can see it even has a knockout for what would become the cartridge port. Now, RadioShack decided to market this project under their own branding and just called it the TRS-80 Videotex. Now, both of these units are the same, the difference is merely cosmetic. Of course, shortly after, the product was released as the TRS-80 Color Computer, now featuring a real cartridge port and other useful things like a cassette port, serial port, 2 joystick ports, and now it was a real computer. There's little doubt that RadioShack wanted another computer in its lineup that was more competitive to the offerings from Atari and Texas Instruments or Apple, which all featured color graphics. And don't forget Commodore's VIC-20, which also debuted in 1980. The TRS line was doing fine for business and education, but was simply not as attractive for a home computer due to the fact that it had no graphics and sound. That's right, these computers couldn't even produce simple beeps, and they were also kind of expensive for a home computer. The addition of the cartridge port was a good cost-saving idea for the consumer because it meant that they could enjoy quality software on the system without the need of an expensive disk drive or the hassle of a cassette drive. There are 2 analog joystick ports on the rear, and by analog, I mean they work similar to the IBM PC and Apple II joysticks, where there are 2 potentiometers allowing for a range of motion to be detected. Interestingly enough, Tandy later ended up using the same joystick interface for the Tandy 1000 series of computers in 1984. So that's at least one peripheral that was shared between the 2 incompatible lines of computers. In fact, I believe this joystick I have here actually came with a Tandy 1000 I bought a few years back. The question is, would the Coco be able to compete with offerings from Apple and Atari and some of the other newcomers onto the market? Well, to find out, let's take a look at how it works. The heart of the color computer was the Motorola 6809, an 8-bit CPU running at 0.895 MHz. An upgrade to Motorola's earlier 6800 CPU, it was one of the most technologically advanced 8-bit CPUs available at the time. However, it was also one of the most expensive. At a time when the Z80 was being sold for $9 a piece, and the 6502 was available for $6 a piece. The 6809 was being sold for a whopping $37 a piece, and while RadioShack likely got a discounted price, it was still an ironic choice for what was supposed to be a low-cost computer. The CPU was never terribly popular outside the color computer ecosystem. The only other well-known device that used it was the Vectrex game console. And providing video for the system was the Motorola 6847 Video Display Generator. It can generate 9 colors from a palette of 12. It features a 32 by 16 text mode and a maximum bitmap resolution of 256 by 192. However, it's a bit more complicated than that. For one thing, the text resolution doesn't at first glance make a lot of mathematical sense. But if you look at a typical text screen, you'll see why. So first of all, I should mention that the text mode is monochrome, and you only get 2 options. Either dark green on light green, which is the default. Also, the chip can do dark orange on light orange. But yeah, this is basically what you get. And if you look a little closer, the text characters are actually defined in ROM as 7 by 5 pixel bitmaps. But the hardware automatically adds in several blank pixels between each character, which is why the text resolution is so low. The graphics modes didn't really fare a lot better. The resolution wasn't terrible by the standards of the day, but as you can see by looking at the various video modes, most of the graphics modes are either monochrome or 4 colors max. And what's worse is you don't really get to pick your 4 colors. Typically you have to pick from one of these palettes of 4 colors. Keep in mind, there's no black or white in these either, which means every pixel on the screen, even the background pixel, has to be one of these colors. And that's why games in the Coco tend to have bizarre color choices. But that wasn't really the fault of the programmers, they were just working with what they had. However, another popular option was to use the high-res mode, the 256 by 192, and use composite NTSC artifact colors. This is very similar to how the Apple II worked, as well as some Atari 800 games and even the IBM CGA when connected to a composite monitor. And this would give you an effective resolution of 128 by 192 with 4 colors. But at least the colors would be black, white, blue, and red, which is a much more usable palette than most of the built-in modes. And from what I can see, the majority of Coco games tended to use this mode. It's pretty easy to spot because any game that has those 4 specific colors, you can bet it's using artifact colors. The downside is it only works on NTSC monitors, so if running on a PAL system, you tend to get just a bunch of vertical lines on a monochrome screen. So we've talked about graphics, but what about sound? Well, the color computer doesn't have a sound chip as such. It relies on a single 6-bit digital analog converter. However, it relies completely on the CPU to feed it in real time. It's similar in that regard to the Apple II. So most of the sounds you hear are simple beeps and clicks. Now, some games will have short tunes, sometimes simulating multiple voices. The trouble with this approach is that the CPU is completely bogged down producing the sound, so typically everything on screen will stop. Another reason you don't typically see games with musical soundtracks is partly because most games are distributed on cartridge. And typical cartridge sizes were 4K, 8K, or 16K. Later games on the Coco 3 could be 32K or larger, but we'll circle back to that machine shortly. The bottom line is, there wasn't much space on these cartridges for any sort of musical soundtracks, even if the system did have a synthesizer. So this is your basic early color computer. You get a chiclet-style keyboard, similar to what you got on a Texas Instruments TI-99 the year before. It wasn't terrible to type on like the Sinclair machines, but it also wasn't great either. So one thing I often have to remind people about is when we're talking about the late 1970s, most people had no idea how to type. The only people that could type were trained typists and secretaries and things like that who used a typewriter. And so for the average person buying a computer, they were going to be hunting and pecking for the keys one at a time. And the layout of the keyboard would not really matter that much. There wasn't that much standardization back then for a lot of the keys on the keyboard. And for those people buying it, it just really didn't matter. That being said, there were aftermarket keyboard upgrades available soon after the machine launched. This machine here is a perfect example of such an upgrade. This is just a drop-in replacement that a customer could install at home and could certainly allow faster and more comfortable typing for those that had the typing skills.
Let the RadioShack TRS-80 put the world of color computing into your home. Instant loading program packs turn any color TV into an exciting game arcade. And there's more.
They did include Microsoft Basic, which was the de facto standard at the time and well into the 1980s. It was vastly superior to the Basic found on the Texas Instruments or Sinclair machines. The system could technically support 64K or even more with the use of banking, but the initial machines only shipped with 4K of RAM, and you could buy that machine for the low price of $399. And RadioShack would sell you an upgrade kit to take your Coco to 16K and add the extended Basic. Or, alternatively, you could buy the machine with those things installed from the factory for $599. Interestingly enough, RadioShack was still selling their Videotech system, which could access their online service, which is really just a rebranded version of CompuServe, which they're very upfront about. And they were selling that machine also for $399. Or another option, which makes far more sense, is to buy a color computer for the exact same price and then get the $29 cartridge, which would allow you to connect to the system. So how did $399 compare in the world of computers in 1980? Well, RadioShack's own professional TRS-80 Model 2 cost $3,800. Granted, that comes with a built-in monitor and disk drive, but as you can see, the color computer certainly provided a much cheaper system for home use. The Apple II was much more expensive at $1,200, and even the Atari 400 was slightly more expensive. The TI-99 was also quite a bit more expensive. Only the Commodore VIC-20 really undercut it in price. So overall, the color computer was a pretty good value for the money. The next year, RadioShack added a new configuration, so besides the 16K machine, you can now get a 32K version as well for $749. RadioShack also branched out and tried to sell the color computer in other markets by changing the name to TDP, which was short for Tandy Data Products. As you can see, the name RadioShack doesn't appear anywhere on the product or packaging, which would make selling it at other retails far more palatable. It was marketed as the TDP System 100 personal computer. As you can see, it very much resembles the Coco. They even had the TDP branded peripherals like this modem here compared with the RadioShack version. A few years later, in 1984, RadioShack upgraded the Coco again, this time giving it a better keyboard, changing the color to white, and giving it 64K of RAM. Unfortunately, the one Eddie has here, somebody has bolted an ugly fan onto the side, so just know that wasn't part of the original system. There's no doubt about the keyboard, though. It is much better than the chiclet version. Interestingly, this product launched at the same time as the new Color Computer 2, and you can see them together here in RadioShack's 1984 catalog. At first glance, they look the same, but if you look closely, you'll see over here on the right advertised as new for 84, while simultaneously offering the brand new Coco 2 version over here on the left. It seems the main reason you'd want the older style is because it was offered with 64K, and the Coco 2, while cheaper, only offered 16K initially. So let's talk about one big problem that RadioShack had, and that was software. RadioShack didn't prohibit third-party companies from making compatible software. However, if the software didn't carry the Tandy name on it and fit in this nice little square package where they put the cartridge games and then the longer packages for the cassette games over here, then they didn't want to have the software in their store. And so, I hate to say it, but much of the software that Tandy provided ended up being cheap ripoffs of other games, and the selection in the store was pretty small. However, there were ways to market third-party games, for example, in Rainbow Magazine, the monthly magazine for Coco users. It had the usual stuff most computer magazines of the era had, such as hardware products, type-in programs, and tips and tricks, but most importantly, it was probably the best outlet for third parties to advertise their games for the system without having to sell out to RadioShack. Unfortunately, this still did little to attract big-name companies like Activision, Broderbund, Electronic Arts, Parker Brothers, Epix, Atari, Accolade, or First Star Software, just to name a few. I mean, sure, some of these companies did make a few titles for the Coco, but they were far and few between. But RadioShack had long had this philosophy that any product that was going to be on their store shelf needed to have their brand name on it. Now, they had a number of brands like RadioShack, Realistic, Tandy, Micronta, so on and so forth, but these were all part of the RadioShack brand names. And they didn't want to have any other products in their store that did not have their brand on it. Now, that may have worked out well for them for other products, but I think for the Color Computer and any of their computer products, to be honest, it was a mistake, in my opinion. And don't get me wrong, I think a lot of computer manufacturers in the early 1980s did not yet realize the importance of having a thriving third-party ecosystem of software. And so one way of looking at this is if you were a customer and you walked into a Target or a Kmart or Toys R Us, you're going to see Commodores and Ataris on the shelf, and then you're going to see an entire aisle full of like recognizable name brand software. A lot of these games would be the same games that you would see in an arcade if you happen to go to arcades during that time. And then when you walk into RadioShack, you'll see a couple of dozen games that no one's ever heard of. And so I don't think that did a whole lot to instill confidence in that platform.
This episode is sponsored by me.
If you like the kind of videos I make, consider visiting my website and take a look at some of the merchandise I offer. I have mouse pads, t-shirts, tumblers, and various games I've designed over the years. And if you'd rather buy these products in person, most of my merchandise is now available at the Time Rift Arcade in Bedford, Texas, where you can just walk in and buy whatever you need. Now, back to the color computer. Okay, so jumping right into 1984, we have a brand new machine, the Color Computer 2. As you can see, it's smaller than the original and has a nicer keyboard. And now it fit with the rest of the industry, which was moving towards this beige plastic look for pretty much all computers at this point. It was also somewhat cost reduced to manufacture. However, it had all the exact same ports as before, maybe rearranged a little bit. But other than that, it didn't offer any features that the old one didn't have in terms of things like graphics and sound and so forth. Another interesting change is the badging. Notice on the old one it says RadioShack TRS-80, but the new one is now badged only as Tandy. The one I have here is also equipped with 64K, which was a very competitive amount of RAM in 1984, which brings us to another topic. Obviously, the Coco 2 could still play all the games from the Coco 1, whether on cartridge or cassette, but now that these computers were starting to standardize on 64K, they started to deal with similar issues to other 8-bit computers. For example, if the most you could fit on a cartridge was 16K, but the machine had 64K of RAM, then obviously using something like a floppy disk to load software would allow you to use that entire 64K. So, how do you use a floppy drive on a Coco? Well, as you may have noticed, there are no ports on the rear of the machine for connecting such a thing. Here's a standard floppy drive, the same kind also used with the older TRS-80 computers. Now, notice it has just this ribbon cable and a power cable. So, what you need to make this work is this disk controller cartridge. This side connects to the computer, and this side connects to that ribbon cable for the disk drive. Now, I must admit, it's a bit clunky to have to connect a disk drive like this, but it works. To demonstrate, I'll use this color math program. It's the only working Coco disk I have at the moment. Now, this unit has 2 drives, and the bottom one is drive 0, so I'll poke that in there. Notice that when booting with the cartridge, it says Disk Extended Color Basic, and that's because the cartridge also adds DOS commands. For example, I can type dir for a directory, and since these are binary files, I will use the loadm command, which stands for Load Machine Language, and when that's done, I can type exec to start the software. And so, using more RAM, the graphics can be considerably more complex, such as in Pegasus and the Phantom Riders, Zaxxon, an adventure game called Calixto Island, or another one called the Interbank Incident, which has a very well-polished interface, Sailor Man, which is an obvious clone with PyPy, or Marble Maze, another obvious clone. Still, none of these games would have been possible on cartridge. And I said we'd come back to the Speech Sound Pack, which also came out in 1984. In addition to a speech synthesizer system, it also included an AY8913 sound chip, which provides 3 programmable voices, similar in capability to the Mockingbird add-on for the Apple II. There were only a handful of games that made use of it though. Pitfall 2 is one such example. Normally the game would be silent during gameplay, like most Coco games, because it's too difficult to use the CPU to generate music reliably during heavy gameplay. However, this was always going to have limited support because of one problem. The computer has one cartridge port. In order to use this device along with a game cartridge or with a disk drive, you would need the multi-pack interface as well. And of course, it was also possible to integrate speech into your basic programs, which could be handy. I'm also told this device does not work with the Coco 3, which is exactly what we're going to look at next. So by 1985, the price of the Coco 2 had dropped to under $200 in many cases, keeping it very competitive with other computers of the time.
And affordable. Now that really pleases me.
The Color Computer 2, sale priced for Christmas, only at RadioShack.
The problem was, even at $99, it had become a little bit of a laughingstock amongst other computer enthusiasts, often nicknaming it the Trash 80, along with other RadioShack computer products. And the thing it just simply couldn't escape from is the fact that at this point in time, it had the worst graphics and sound of any computer in production. It needed an upgrade in order to survive. Enter the Color Computer 3 in 1986. At first glance, it looks almost identical to the older one, but I'll show you a few obvious differences. For example, the badge over here says 64K Color Computer 2. This one here says 128K Color Computer 3. Also, the Coco 2 was still using this old cursor key arrangement where you needed two hands to use it. And on the Coco 3, they finally combined all of those into one section. And for some reason, they added these two function keys, F1 and F2. Let's look around on the rear. This is the older model. And then on the newer one obvious difference is that it now features RCA jacks for audio and video. This is long overdue because now you can actually use real computer monitors with the Coco instead of just televisions. Also, there's one more port that's hidden on the bottom, and that's an RGB video port. It's an unusual connector, but it's a pretty standard signal, and we'll circle back to that shortly. For the moment, let's look at how the Coco 3 improved upon its predecessor. The 128K of RAM on the badge is an obvious giveaway. That's double what the previous machine had. It also had a faster CPU. It could run at the old speed for compatibility or run at essentially twice the speed if needed. And last but not least, it had much better video capabilities. It had over a dozen new video modes and was also still backwards compatible with the old modes as well. Many of these modes had full 16 color support, where any pixel on the screen was directly addressable as one of those colors. That was quite powerful for an 8-bit system. It also had a palette of 64 colors to pick from. Now, suddenly the Color Computer went from having one of the worst graphics capabilities on the market to suddenly one of the best. In fact, the only computers that could really outperform it were 16-bit computers like the Amiga or Atari ST. Now, I'll start by showing a few games that were available for both the older Coco and for the Coco 3 so you can see the difference. I'll start here with Tetris. Now, I should point out that this came out on a 32K cartridge, so while it does exploit a little higher screen resolution, there probably wasn't any extra room on the cart for a bunch of fancy graphics. Likewise, here's Arkanoid on the original Coco. And now take a look at the Coco 3. In fact, here are a few Coco 3 exclusive titles, like Gauntlet, or Thexter, RoboCop, and Rad Warrior. And with these new graphics capabilities also came new basic commands to allow users to create graphics in their own programs. Okay, so now I want to connect up RGB using my RGB modded television and this makeshift cable that I put together. I'm also going to connect up composite, partly because I need the audio from that, but also because I want to be able to use the switch to go back and forth and let you see the difference. Now, the bad news is my camera does not really like this bright green background. It shows up kind of blurry, but trust me, it is crystal clear in person. Now switch over to composite mode and you should be able to see it looks much worse. So yeah, RGB mode is absolutely the best way to enjoy your Coco 3. Here's the texture, and look on the intro screen, it even uses the 80 column text mode and it's totally sharp and clear. I'll switch over to composite just so you can see the difference there. Otherwise, I mean, games that are designed for the Coco 3 look spectacular in RGB mode. The closest analogy would be looking at an Amiga or an IBM with EGA graphics. However, there is one significant drawback with using RGB mode, and that's running older Coco titles. Now, if you happen to start a game that uses the weird 4-color palette offered by the video chip, like this baseball game, then everything will look exactly like it's supposed to, only sharper. However, if you start up a game that's designed for NTSC artifact colors, which the majority of games were designed to use, then you just get pixelated monochrome. And that's because these games are relying on a side effect of NTSC that doesn't exist when you're using RGB. And that's why it's handy to be able to switch over to composite mode so these games can play as intended. And I should also mention that even though Tandy did a great job on improving the graphics capabilities on the Coco 3, the sound remained exactly the same, which is unfortunate. The only consolation is that with the faster CPU, there was often more CPU time left over to generate sound and music. One problem still plagued the Coco, and that was market share. This is basically what the personal computer market looked like in 1986. So if you were one of the big software developers, it would be hard to justify the budget to develop software for the Coco 3, which was less than 2% of the market at that point, despite the new machine with better graphics. And if you think about it, it's actually worse than that, because within the established base of Coco computers, only some of those were Coco 3, and only some of those had disk drives, so we're talking less than 1% of the computer market here. Now, surprisingly, Sierra did produce some of their adventure games for the Coco 3, and they looked more or less like their EGA or Amiga counterparts. The only problem was the market was even smaller than what I showed before, and that's because these games typically require a RAM expansion to take the machines up to 512K. If you happen to own a Coco or are thinking about getting one essential modern cartridge would be the SDC, which allows you to insert an SD card full of games, thus eliminating the need for a disk drive or a mountain of cartridges. Speaking of, now it's time to look at some modern homebrew games for the Coco, such as Digger 3. And there are also a number of really good modern ports of some of the original arcade hits, which look and sound pretty much identical to the arcades. And of course, there's Quarks. That's right, the game I designed on the C64 and VIC-20 is now available on the Color computer. Paul Shoemaker did a great port, and what you're looking at here is the Coco 3 version. The screen resolution being used here is actually not the usual mode that most games opt for, but instead the 160 by 192 mode, which is more similar to the Commodore 64's multicolor mode, allowing the same graphics assets to be used. Paul also made a version for the Coco 1 and 2, which use artifact color modes, but are surprisingly still very playable. The complete version of this one is available for free on my website, located in the shareware section, and the Coco 3 version will be shipping as a cartridge and is available for pre-order right now. And last but not least, I need to mention the Dragon computers. These were sold mostly in Europe, I think, but there were some sold in North America too, like this one from Tanno. These computers weren't exactly 100% compatible with the Coco, but they were close enough in design that most software could be easily tweaked to run on either machine. Unfortunately, in Europe there was no NTSC artifact colors, so you had to live with the crazy palette, or for those games designed for North America, you just see a monochrome image with a bunch of vertical lines. However, I don't think there is a Dragon equivalent to the Coco 3. These were more in line with the Coco 1 and 2. Well guys, that about wraps up the story of the Tandy color computer, at least the best that I can tell it. Now, the product was eventually discontinued in 1991, but it was on the market for 11 years, which is not bad by any standard. I do think that the sales volume could have been a lot higher had RadioShack done certain things differently, but that's all in the past now. But that wraps it up for this episode. As always, thanks for watching.